2021. Seemingly the year of things you could swear were only released a couple of years ago, turning out to actually be a decade old. And given how there's very little else to do for obvious reasons, many people are going back through these old shows, movies and other pieces of media that can now be convicted of criminal offences. And whilst I could make a video on many of these, you can't think criminal offences without thinking of the amazing world of Gumball. Starting in September 2011, well, technically May, but I have the misfortune of being British, so September. September 5th of 2011, to be exact, 10 years ago today. And it is by far the most experimental and unique show Cartoon Network has put out. As the title would imply, it obviously focuses on the misadventures of the central character, Bobert. Bobert 6B is a adorable little robot boy who, from his perspective, we view the entirety of the show. I swear! He desperately wants to relate to his fellow students of the more alive variety at the show's central location of Elmore Junior High. None of those aforementioned students having any relevance whatsoever. The show employs an experimental format where each episode is of varying lengths, with the runtime ranging from minutes to seconds, depending on the episode, with no real conformity to it, leading to what I'll admit is varying levels of emotionally engaging and narratively gripping storytelling. But trust me, each episode is at least both, and sometimes more. Now, to the uninitiated, this might seem remarkably odd. Like, really, the average episode duration is under a minute. How do you monetize that? How do you place 2 blocks of ads on an episode? That's not even long enough to be one of the. How do you even advertise a show like this? There's no way this show is that seems stupid to watch your friend of yourself irresponsible of a network he doesn't do. And these are all fair points to bring up when discussing the show, but this really was how the show was formatted. Definitely. And you might reasonably say, yeah, but the show's literally named after someone else. But that is actually a creative decision done in order to show the innate artificiality in the concept of a main character. Now, in real life, there's no such thing as a main character, which is why the show is called The Amazing World of Gumball. As the titular character, Gazuka, is little more than a side character with absolutely no significance at all. But still, this amazing world is just as much his as it is Bobert's or anyone else's. Now this point is so poignant and intentional that I feel, as the legally certified #1 Bobert fan, it's only fair that I go over the amazing themes, writing and messaging in every single one of his episodes in the amazing world of Gumball. Which is every episode, so I don't know why I specify that. Cut. The show reinforces the theme I just went on about, with its numbering, as it very consciously chooses to have said numbering be inconsistent, with season openers not being listed as episode 1 often, and not having each episode go up sequentially, as in real life, it's not like every day feels like it's worth counting. So this show doesn't. And, well, with that out of the way, let's start with the first ever episode, Series 1, Episode 3, which is called The Third, but it's really the first, but officially it's the third. So a quick aside I should mention, the show is really well known for, So, said titles generally don't reflect what happens episode to episode in a literal sense, but upon closer inspection they reveal what the episodes truly mean. The show eases you into this concept, however, with this one being relatively simple. We open with one of Bobbyton's early attempts at blending in with his classmates, as a pair of clearly irrelevant side characters try to teach him the game of punchies. He tries to follow through with the game and become part of the two's friend group, you know, the third friend, but he seems to go a bit overboard with the power on the hit, and then, well, he doesn't seem to be doing too well for the rest of the day. Now, this might seem a little bit uneventful at first glance, but in reality it serves as the perfect intro to the show as a whole, through its simple and subtle narrative of the Bobberino himself trying to follow through a simple social cue, and then once he fails, we see him throughout the rest of the episode, just sulking around the school. Take note of his body language at the lunch table. He's slouched and at this awkward angle, sort of turned 3/4 to the side away from everyone in order to avoid any eye contact. His arms are turned inwards and his head is firmly down in order to come off as the exact opposite of open. So he won't be approached and instead can go over the 77 separate ways he devised that he could have better handled the situation in peace. A pretty simple start to the show. It's just sort of one gag and then introduction to some of the base elements of Bob that the rest of the show explores, but still, I think it's a pretty good start to the show overall and a 9 out of 10. This one's simple. Bob informs some students about the upcoming solar eclipse and they mistake it as a sign of the end of the world. It's a simple comedic episode that serves well to balance out the more emotional pilot. Sure, there's not much going on under the hood with this one, hence the simpler episode title correlation, but still, that doesn't mean it's bad at all, right?
I'll take that as a yes.
8 out of 10. Okay, so far the titles have had pretty clear correlations with the episodes, and the episodes themselves had complete, easy to understand, if short, narratives. This episode, The Dress, however, is the first time that changes. It follows a fairly disjointed series of events seeming to centre on this new student character in a dress, who never appears again. But more importantly, we see every single prominent character in this episode put on some sort of dishonest front in order to appear better to their peers. For example, when Bobert's class is asked to take out their homework, we see that every student seems to be fine with handing in their homework. However, then one student decides to offer up their homework to be copied despite no one asking. Then another, and another, one of which being Bob himself. And we know that Bobert struggled with making friends, so this helps contextualize this scene as Bobert and assumedly the other students trying to present themselves as more helpful so their peers will view them more positively. We see this guy trying to present himself as the boyfriend of the dress character from earlier so he can seem cooler to his classmates, which she evidently isn't as she seemingly flies into the sun to avoid him. Guess he can't take a hint. Obviously we don't see her make contact though, it's a children's network, we just see the class's reactions. Then we see this guy, who I don't believe is important to the show at all, who makes a pretty crass comment after the dress character dies about her not knowing how to not embarrass herself despite him being completely naked, showing him putting on a facade of being better than everyone around him despite him being significantly worse. So what this episode is saying, really, isn't just, look, this one character is wearing a dress, follow their story. But in a way, they're all wearing a dress, because the dress just represents the facade the cast all put on to make themselves look better than they are. That's what the dress is. That's what the point of the dress is. A very solid, well-made episode. I'd say it's a good 8 out of 10. The Pressure is one of the shorter episodes of the show, a term I do not use loosely. At barely a second long, this simple looping footage you're seeing, that's the entirety of it. Not the loop itself, no, just one loop of it. That is the whole episode. Which is great, as the whole episode serves as a fun meta gag on the pressures of creating an animated series. Granted, it does feel a little early in the show for an episode of its nature, but hey, at least the title episode correlation is simple this time. 8 out of 10. Now yes, this episode does start with a shot of a ghost at the cafeteria, but don't let that fool you, this episode's title is a bit deeper than that. The creators make a point to never frame Bobert at the centre of the screen in this episode, as the titular ghost isn't actually any form of poltergeist at all. In fact, it's the old Bobster here, as this episode shows how the intensely intricate character of Bobert 6B views himself. He goes through his life in the day-to-day, often not making any sort of major impact on those around him, because whilst we're really invested in him as a character, in universe, he's just sort of a regular student who no one particularly cares about, who some days just sort of drifts around aimlessly, not being able to affect anyone around him. Just like the ghost. Good premise, execution is a bit pretentious, but does its job. 8 out of 10. This episode actually has the unique distinction of technically being the first episode ever aired in the UK. It aired on the 2nd of May 2011 here, ahead of the rest of the show as a sort of preview episode, like Cartoon Network used to like to do quite a lot. But officially it's by no means the first episode. It's officially episode 13, but actually episode 6, because the whole not every day counts spiel. The episode itself starts with a few students being locked inside a classroom where their teacher, Miss Simeon, threatens to give them all the detention unless they find out which one of them assaulted the school's principal. Among them there's this blue guy who I don't believe has appeared in the show before, and the rest of the students determine it must be him who assaulted the principal because his yearbook photo is terrible, leading him to run into Bobert assumedly while he's trying to escape the other students. Bobert then provides proof to him and then later the other students that the blue dude wasn't actually the culprit, taking us to what is the most hotly debated scene among all Bob scholars. For it seems that we leave the perspective of Bobert for a minute so we can see a scene of how the crime was committed. I would, however, strongly argue that this is not the case, as the creators deliberately make the artistic decision to never do a conventional flashback, but instead show the entire thing through a hologram that Bob projects as he narrates all of it. I'd say the episode has Bob in its frame for its entirety, as the hologram is just an extension of Bob, and therefore is just Bob. So after Bob destroys the self-esteem of the entire supporting cast,
Penny hung her hideous painting on the wall. Gumball turned up, looking love-struck as usual. Darwin walked down the stairs, trailing toilet paper like a nincompoop. Rocky dropped a bottle of chemicals on the floor, looking quite old.
we assume that was in fact their teacher, Miss Simeon, who committed the heinous assault on the principal. Then just as the students are about to make her pay for her crimes, she deletes the memory of Bob, leading to a truly heartbreaking scene. And the episode ends there, leaving a potent message about the criminal justice system and how it's designed to keep those in power from ever facing their misdeeds. A really strong episode that has definitely earned its 9 out of 10 rating. The only reason this episode is notable at all is it contains the first appearance of the titular character Glaciator. I mean, I think so at least. If he did appear at any point before, it couldn't have been in any sort of notable way. But outside of that, there's not really anything else to say on this one. Golem and his brother dressing karate keys, and they get laughed at for it. Nothing more, nothing less. So a pretty clear 8 out of 10 is what I'm saying. In the episode The Party, Bob gets invited to a party. Shocker, I know. Outside of this episode's just sort of standard Bob fare. He misinterprets what people mean by taking them literally. He sits awkwardly to avoid contact with other— Wait, is that the same shot again? Anyways, after that he gets to the party proper. It starts tame, eventually gets wild, and— wait, go back? Oh damn, look at him go. Iconic. Okay, the Bobert dance bumps up to a 9 out of 10. Any objections will be met with violent force. Bobert is one of the best characters in the show. I'd like to think by this point we've established that. But the characters in-universe aren't nearly as enlightened as us in that regard. Please, please, put away your weapons. They're children. Anyways, this episode deals with Bobert getting jealous of his living classmates for their emotions. Which, there's some dramatic irony being applied here, as throughout the episode the audience sees Bobert experience a suite of emotions, but because he's not organic, he overlooks them, and goes about hating himself for this apparent lack of human emotion. Well, I suppose technically not human, but you get the point. And the episode shows him going to increasingly extreme lengths in order to feel real emotions by imitating and subsequently stealing the voice, look, and eventually life of the titular character Grandma Nana. As even though he seems to like him enough at this point, he thinks the life heist is the only way he'll be able to feel real emotions. Of course, Ghibli doesn't like this, but you know what? That's on him. It's not Bobert's fault he lives his life so much better than him. Anyways, there's a bit of a scuffle, Bob is rebooted, everything goes back to normal with a fun little end gag implying that Bobert's going to do the same thing to the brother character. This is a really good one. The comedy is solid if not exceptional, and it has perhaps the most overt insight into Bobert's mind in the entirety of the show so far. 9 out of 10. This is a simple one. Bobert's class goes on a field trip through a forest to have a picnic. They're told to look at their maps. A couple of students don't and therefore wind up getting to the picnic spot late and naked and then eat out of the trash. Bobert, however, does look at his map and therefore doesn't show up to the picnic spot late and naked and then doesn't eat anything out of the trash. Not really anything wrong with this one, but also there's not really much to say about this one full stop. But it has Bob, so 8 out of 10. As the title would imply, Bobert is a genius, and in this particular episode we see that explored when it comes to his computer literacy compared to the regular denizen of Elmo. One of said denizens, he teaches how to use the internet in this episode. Not really much to this one aside from a series of good jokes though. 8 out of 10. So this one opens with Bob and a group of students preparing for a game of dodgeball. Then it smash cuts to a scene of Bob and a few students from earlier watching some men on those weird springy horse things they have in parks. Does anyone actually know what those things are called? Well, I guess I don't, so that must be indicative of everyone on the planet. Anyways, this scene happens presumably shortly after the opening scene of the episode. However, if you pay closer attention, you'll see that the two men in the park are actually two of the kids from the opening scene, now hit by puberty harder than the cinema icon Fred Figglehorn between his first and third movies. Which is why this episode very cleverly uses a smash cut between the dodgeball and park scenes, as it really helps hammer home how quickly they've aged. Well, that and the fact that everyone else looks the exact same as earlier. Well, apart from the looks of complete and total disgust they all have. Well, all but one. Bobert doesn't have a look of disgust on his face. He has a look of abject horror. Because Bobert's not grossed out by a couple guys in the park. Instead, he's horrified because he's realised that before too long, he'll be just like them. Too old to ride the springy horse without ridicule. Truly, a fate worse than death. And given how this episode deals with this theme that the rest of the industry is too scared to touch, I have to give it a 9 out of 10. Now, it's fair to say this is not an enjoyable episode. That much is apparent. This episode is, for lack of a better phrase, a Bob torture episode, as it entirely centres on the obviously undeserved torment of the best character in the show. It starts with Bobber and a few other students asking that piece of Galador to join their club of rejects. And to quote the main man himself, Gravitac then
laughed at our loneliness.
And then when the Bob Squad, name pending approval, tried to get the littlest bit of payback with an innocent prank, Gazpacho then rounds up his family to assault then kidnap these children. Where are you taking them? Look at my poor baby boy, someone save him, please! Now this seems like a pretty open and shut case. The episode openly abuses Boberto, and I mean, I admitted it's not enjoyable, so it's gotta be our first bad episode of the show, right? And yes, I must concede it's not a fun episode to watch, but I have to admit, it's a good episode to watch. Sure, on the surface level, the episode does seem quite mean-spirited, but if you pay attention to what it's really saying, it's entirely sympathetic to the plight of the Bob Squad. It just chooses to be realistic in the way that it depicts that tragedy can befall innocent people, and it decides to pull no punches in the depiction of how these horrible things can affect innocent people. You know, a real Schindler's List of an episode. And this laugh-a-minute riot explores its central tragedy through the deep, profound meaning given to every single joke throughout its entire runtime. And when I say every single one of them, I mean literally the only one that there is.
To the Nerdmobile!
Now at first glance you may think this is just a throwaway joke mocking the Reject Club for being pathetic, but if you look just a little bit closer you'll see it means so much more than that. To put the scene entirely in context here, the Reject Club have just been mocked and rejected by Grogu, so they decide to put themselves out there and get revenge, because if action cartoons have taught me anything, it's that revenge is always justified. And the moment that they decide to do that, they immediately drive away in the Nerdmobile. And what it makes clear is how the rejects, and more importantly, Bobber, are entirely reliant on imaginary scenarios based on media, as they have very little substantial experience in interacting with other people in the real world. Because as you may have noticed, the Nerdmobile both isn't real, and is a hilariously clever pun and reference to the opening line from the hit film Lego Batman and SpongeBob movie.
To the Batmobile. Let's go.
Showing how just as they've made the declaration that they're going to stand up to the latest in the line of the many bullies they've had in the years of being the rejects, that they have to retreat back into the safety net of their imagined scenarios in order to be able to do it. And with such introspective and interesting character work being given here, I have to admit that this is a quality episode. So as much as it pains me to give an episode with this much of Bob in emotional and physical pain this rating, I have to give it a 9 out of 10. I don't know. This episode entirely consists of Bobert standing on a schoolyard with the title The 8. Your guess is as good as mine. 9 out of 10. Oh no, oh god, he's been cursed. This is not a drill. Bob is compromised. He's been turned into a foe. Oh god, save him. Ah! I give this a Save My Beautiful Robo Son out of 10. In the show's first ever series finale, we see Bob is informed that Gargamel's gonna fight a T-Rex, and the prospect of this is so innately exciting it causes the entire crowd to unanimously break into cheer until the fight itself finally arrives. But then we see how this was a mistake, as by supporting the fight, Bobert is actually just preserving the cycle of violence that will continue to harm people, and therefore Bob must learn an important lesson. And he does when Gorgon Heap jumps on his lunch table and ruins everyone's nuggies.
No.
And because of that, Bobert grows past this, and only does the exact same thing twice again. Truly, a phenomenal character arc. 9 out of 10. A pretty good start to the show as a whole, but it definitely feels like a start. Like, you can definitely tell they're trying to find their footing here. Most episodes this season generally trend towards just being simple fun, establishing the character of Bobert and how he relates to the student body. Don't get me wrong, there are episodes like The Third, The Robot, or The Club that are emblematic of the deep themes and character work that the rest of the show would champion. They're just slightly fewer and farther between here. Well, that's one season down. 5 to go. I guess I'd better get started on Series 2 then. So despite all these snazzy new redesigns and the obvious bump in animation quality, this episode doesn't actually have much to it. Bob and Co are playing in their school band pretty well. Well, pretty well up until Galvani over here misses his cue. And that of course disappoints the rest of the band. And of course, as you've probably put together, this episode is called The Fridge because that's what they want to hit Ginkle over here with. And since I also want to hit him with a fridge, I'm going to give this one 8 out of 10. Yeah, kind of stop this one. You see what appears to be a Sonic OC run past Bob at max speed in order to get to his locker full of weed killer and related products, which he's seemingly gonna use to kill the minor flower character of Leslie. Kind of funny how dark this is. Granted, we see him in later episodes, so it's not like the OC succeeded. Well, unless you watch in Machete Order. But that's besides the point. This episode was fun enough, it took me off guard, 8 out of 10. Starting in a familiar place, this episode opens with Bob sitting alone on a near-empty table. But unlike earlier episodes, Bob seems to be less uncomfortable as a whole here, as unlike in previous episodes, he's actually facing Banana Joe, the other person on the table. He's not talking up a storm or anything, this is Bob we're talking about, he's just sitting there. But unlike before, it seems like because Banana Joe probably understands him more, that Bob is able to just sit there comfortably at least. But then once Gumby sits down here, that all changes, as Gonzo over here is clearly trying to trick Joe into admitting that he chewed his pen. And the second you see him do this, any sense of progress from Bob is lost, as Bob immediately turns his head away and seemingly just tries to block them out of his peripheral vision in order to remove himself from this awkward situation. And as the conversation continues, he continues to turn his head further and further away from the pair. The scene ends with Joe deciding to be the better man and lending his glue to Grover, asking him not to chew on it. We then cut to a little bit later as Joe passes Bobert in the hallway with a cheerful whistle as Bob makes us all feel cheerful. But then as he moves away from Bobert, we see his eyes begin to widen and the whistle slowly gets slower, and more ominous. And given the interaction we've just seen him in, it leaves the audience asking many important questions. Like, did he chew the pen? Or did he not chew the pen? Really thought-provoking stuff. I really quite like how this episode balances both development for Bob, but also throws in some development for Banana Joe, this quite minor character from the show. It really helps to flesh him out, and I quite like that. 9 out of 10. Simple and to the point. That's how I'd describe this episode. Gimli gets a new phone and tries to find out why no one's called him. A series of solid jokes proceed, ending with Bob delivering a brilliant final punchline. 8 out of 10. As you'd expect, this episode centers on, surprise surprise, an apology. But in keeping with the meta nature of this show, it's not one between any of the characters within the episode, but rather between the creators of the show and the audience. The episode opens with a rather crass bit about the students of Bobert's class being exposed to their teachers' posterior, with the entire class being too uncomfortable to touch the topic. When just before they decide to broach this subject, this plot is abruptly cut off to show us a scene of Boberto taking on a T-Rex, before promptly asking the audience which one is more powerful, as both the characters within the show and the audience watching promptly erupt into applause. Or at least I'd assume the rest of the audience did. I mean, I obviously did. Solid 9 out of 10. Now, one may be disappointed that this episode only showed a brief segment of the Bobert T-Rex fight, but don't worry, they'll get to that eventually. Words hurt, and therefore you should be careful how you use them. It's a pretty common message in kids' media, and for good reason. It's an important thing to learn young, and who else is going to tell them? Their parents. And as you can probably guess, that's what this episode deals with. Like, it would have to be. Otherwise, this would be an entirely pointless tangent. But back to the episode itself. It depicts this message in a pretty simple way. After a long day at school, we see Gygas's brother. You know, the brother character actually appears quite a lot, and I don't think I know his name. Let me just... Oh, right. Charles. Charles starts becoming very vocal in his opinions on those around him, and then ropes in the Bobster and a few other characters to break into a musical number to convey said point. Gru isn't a fan of how Charles is acting, so he challenges him to an insult battle. Said battle is shown as this really well done Street Fighter homage, accompanied by a whole art style change, which is great, but as nice as it is, the fight itself isn't actually the focus of this scene. The focus is, of course, Bobert in the background. As we see, whilst Bob is out here supporting the fight to begin with, the episode ends with Bob and the rest of the people watching leaving after realizing that using words to hurt people's feelings isn't actually as entertaining as we'd all like to pretend that it is. So after they see the pain that it causes, they decide to stop supporting it, breaking the cycle of emotional harm, intentionally paralleling the Series 1 finale in order to show a gripping conclusion to this important character arc, by showing how Bob's experiences have changed him. This episode really shows the show earning its stripes. Through a quite run-of-the-mill moral, it manages to pull together a solid conclusion to the show's first multi-season arc. 9 out of 10. Hard to decipher. If I had to describe this episode in 3 words, those would be it. It's incredibly short, just showing Bob staring longingly at some other kids having fun before they fly past him later in the hallway. This episode being titled The Skull seems pretty disconnected from the rest of the episode if taken at face value. But this episode is going for something a bit more complex than face value. A skull represents death, or the definitive end to something alive's physical development. So to broaden the title's meaning, we could say it represents something or someone that is unable to develop or grow in other ways, which is likely what the creators envisioned. At this point in the show, we have seen that the vast majority of episodes center on Bobert existing parallel to a more conventional story, usually being on his own, with certain episodes like The Robot centering on him wanting to expand and grow his interpersonal skills so he can have the interpersonal relationships that he laments lacking in episodes like the next one, The Bear. And this episode shows a solid glimpse into the mind of the Bob. And whilst as the show continues, we do see Bobert grow and develop the few interpersonal relationships he does have, have into more meaningful ones. At this point, we've established he has pretty low self-esteem and doubts himself a lot. So of course, while he's sitting here alone, watching a way more interesting story play out in front of him than anything he's ever done, that's exactly where his mind is going to go. He's going to think that this is the definitive end for him, that he's going to be stuck on the sidelines for the rest of his life. A really introspective derp dive into Bob's psyche. Yeah, derp dive, nice one, Dick. 9 out of 10. A longer episode here. In this one, Bobert loses a bet and therefore has to be a slave for 24 hours. For most of the episode, Bob's in slave mode, so we don't get much exploration of him as a character in the majority of this episode. This in no way harms the episode, as the slave mode segments feature some good character work for the supporting cast, and we do see smaller glimpses of Bob's personality shine through here and there. And whilst this on its own is an entertaining 8 out of 10, we also get the start and the end of the episode, which...
Computing, friends, girls, games. Result 0.
Yeah, they do the heavy lifting. This is one of the few times we see Bobert openly acknowledge his lack of meaningful interpersonal relationships, as I mentioned in the last episode. And this episode really shows how much this affects him through the lengths he's willing to go and try form some interpersonal relationships. Shown most clearly when after all the pain and embarrassment we see him put throughout this episode, without even thinking, he asks to play another game, just so he's not alone for a little bit longer. So much really good character work here, mixed in with consistently funny jokes. This definitely gets this episode a very well deserved first 10 out of 10. A simple episode once again, this time with one of the most accurate titles in the show. The episode simply shows Bobert doing a little dance before being interrupted. The title simply refers to the unmistakable fact that Bobert is not just a hero, but the hero. A fact that cannot be overstated. 9 out of 10. As you may have picked up on, this show tends to focus a fair bit on the character of Bobert, but this episode introduces the rarer breed of episode. The Photo Bob episode. These episodes are generally used to show the importance of Bobert through his absence, but still keeping him in frame for the entire episode by relegating his appearance to that of a reused PNG or something. And no, the curse doesn't count, that wasn't a photo, he was actually cursed, and none of you tried to save him! But anyways, as the first one of these, they play it pretty safe. The episode's called The Sidekick, which is a role entirely defined by another person who's generally viewed as more important than the sidekick themselves. And this episode shows how much the show itself is defined by Bobert and how starkly different it feels without him. 8 out of 10. So while a little bit disjointed, this episode overall makes a powerful statement on beauty standards, as we see how the interactions of 3 separate people affected by the standards wind up affecting Bobert. Whether it be jealousy, vanity, or anger, these reactions all wind up showing perfectly how said standards hurt people. Also, it's just nice to see Bob helping out the burning child and also just generally being the best boy. 9 out of 10. So the audience is just kinda thrown into the deep end with this one. From the moment we lose the title card, we jump right into Bobert and a crowd of students berating Grouchy for messing with the relationship between 2 students, Alan and Carmen. This continues all the way throughout the rest of the school day, up until another student goes up to him and suggests a way to fix this, leading to the greatest non-Bob line in all of television.
Of course! I'm gonna dress up as a girl and kiss Alan! I need a really believable name though. How about Barbara? Or Shatanya? Oh, I know. Get out of here with your stupid idea!
Bob informs his classmates of what's happening before they enter the cafeteria, seeing that the plan worked exactly as planned. Then Bob and his classmates leave, comedically sick of what they spent the entire episode trying to get back together. Not much meat to the bones of this one, but once again...
Get out of here with your stupid idea!
So yeah, you get why I'm giving this a 9 out of 10. Well, this episode entirely consists of Bob sitting in a chair, which symbolizes that Bobert is the title is the game, which is it's a reference to the popular board game, The Game of Life. Wait, no, I just thought of something. The episode is actually about how life is an unfair game, rigged against the player, because we see Bobert living and he doesn't seem to be that happy about it, I guess, probably. they'll probably buy this as a genuine episode plot, right? Ah, right, I thought so. 8 out of 10. So, not really much to say about this one. It's just a single, admittedly funny, meta joke. Kinda cool to see Greedo buy into the delusion that he's the main character though. 8 out of 10. This episode is pretty weak, made worse by the fact that, as the name would suggest, this was originally intended to be the show as a whole's finale, as they didn't know if they'd be renewed for a series 3 at this point. The episode just consists of Bob getting shoved over by this schmuck. The episode itself seeming to be just a bitter rejection of the expected cancellation the creative team thought was coming, which, while I understand, as if the show had ended here, Bob's arc would not have come even remotely close to its completion. But given how that very much didn't happen, it makes the whole episode just seem a bit petty. So definitely the worst episode in the show so far. And unfortunately, that makes me kind of feel like I have to give it a rating of a solid 8 out of 10. It had Bob. I cried tears of joy throughout the entire runtime. Bada bing, bada boom, that's series 2. Some really noticeable changes here. Practically every character gets some sort of redesign. Bobert, of course, being the most prominent. He's much less rounded, especially when it comes to his head. The ring around his eye is much thicker, and he loses the black stripe going down the lower right side of his face, among other smaller things. We also hear a pretty clear change in his voice. It sounds much more monotone and, well, robotic than in series 1.
I'm a real boy on the inside, but not on the outside.
Computing, friends, girls, games. Result, 0.
And while I get why this was done, unlike with the physical redesign, I am not the biggest fan of this. As in a very surface level way, it makes him seem much less like a character and much more like a machine. And I know he is a machine, but he's one established to have sentience and emotions, even if he doesn't believe so. But this change makes the more monkey-brained among the audience just skim over his character as if there's nothing to him. And don't get me wrong, they don't stop writing him well in this season. He has plenty of great character moments. I'd say maybe even more than in the first one, in fact. But I do feel this change negatively affected the general audience's interpretation of this character, making him seem just the tiniest bit more like a piece of artillery rather than a character. And that's all I gotta say on this season, so let's move on to the next. As the audience, we all understand how every character who is not Bobert in this show is the worst and sucks major nardole. But as I went over before, we are blessed with this knowledge because we are able to entirely view this world through the perspective of the best character in Cartoon Network history. But to the various lesser characters in the show, they wouldn't see their world that way. They wouldn't see Bob as the cultural icon he obviously is. So to them, he's not the protagonist. Certain characters may even be under the delusion that they are. The show has made an effort to establish that this is a key failing of the character of Gaviscon Double Action over here. Which, hey, to be fair, they did name the show after him. So this is a reasonable amount of totally stupid for him to be. Said stupidity is central to this episode as it follows him and Charles trying to find the titular fan, which they feel like they deserve when completely unaware to them the person walking right past them that they don't even acknowledge is the reason their fan never showed up. Because just like everyone else, she was never their fan. She had taste. She was a Bobert fan. I think so, at least. I've got it on pretty good authority that most people are Bob fans.
Good evening. This is McDonald's Joshua speaking.
Hi, hello. You would call yourself a Bobert fan, right?
What?
So yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm not alone in this belief. 8 out of 10. Our first of 2 Halloween episodes here. This one's a take on a classic zombie infection story. The episode starts like a regular episode with Bob in school, but then as it goes on, we see it switch over to a found footage homage as Bob gets infected and then goes on to infect others. I don't really have much more to say on this one. I'm not the biggest fan of zombie media, with the obvious exception of Lego Zombie Movie Virus 7G Part 2 and only Lego Zombie Movie Virus 7G Part 2. But giving on this one has Bob 8 out of 10. Very much in the same vein of The Flower, this episode takes you off guard with its pretty dark subject matter in regards to a background character. This episode, however, goes one step further and shows the actual character's death with him being eaten alive. Granted, just like in The Flower, we see him in episodes that come after, but machete order, shut up. 8 out of 10. This episode is very much centered on identity, hence the name. I'm great at writing, I love it. You see a completely new character talking to the recurring ghost background character of Carey about some sort of battle of the bands, and from the way Carey reacts, we very much get the feeling that the new character has never touched an instrument in his life. This is very similar to the dress and the way it portrays a character putting forth some sort of facade in order to appear better to their peers. Of course, in this character's case, they're trying to project themselves as the archetypical jock character. Now, what differentiates this from the dress is the fact that this conflict never affects Bobert. In fact, all we see of Bobert is him passing through the hallway as we hear this snippet of this greater conversation these two characters are having. This is beneficial to the show's themes as a whole. And whilst a big part of this show is that whilst in any other show Bobert would just be a background character, in this show he's very much definitely the main character. And yes, this does really help with one of the show's central themes of everyone dealing with their own personal issues, and even if you never know the extent in which they affect these people, they are just as valid as your own. This theme can only truly be done well if we see, no, it's not just Bobert. Every character in this world is written as if they were a real person, and we could just as easily center a show on any of them. Of course, they never would center the show on any of the other characters, because, you know, no character can compare to Bob in any way, he is divine. But it would be unfair of us to hold these characters to the standard of the Bobster. So we won't. Or at least not that much. This episode really helps with the show's central theme, so 9 out of 10. Imagine, if you will, it's the middle of November. The weather is cold and miserable, but not cold and miserable enough for you to at least get snow. The people around you are cold and miserable, and you're cold and miserable. You're at that dreadful midpoint in school where you're just a couple weeks into a term. I should mention, at this point in time, you're in the target demographic, which is the 6 to 12 age bracket. Anyways, you're a couple weeks into the term. Just far enough into the term that you've stopped being set to easy work, but not far enough that the end is even remotely close to being in sight. You're doing the same thing, day in, day out. The stores aren't selling actual cream eggs right now. Pretty much it's the closest thing to hell for a child. And whilst this routine is generally what's keeping your stupid, dumb child brain down, there is just one part of this routine that keeps you going. Right between Sundays and Tuesdays, you'll be graced with a weekly helping of the Bobster. Thanks to the meaty wait a minute, was it still meaty at this point? No, at this point it had been downgraded to the Mega Mondays block. Either way, every Monday, that gaping pit in your soul was filled by the funny Robotboi's comedic hijinks. But what if on Monday you go to chow down on your weekly serving of Haha Funny Bot, but instead you're faced with a family-sized platter of not that? All you get is some kidnappers. No, I will not move past them kidnapping him, they kidnapped him. Arguing about something that you don't care about, whilst the little image of Bob hides right here, in what is scientifically proven to be the worst part of the frame probably. All of a sudden that pit's not being filled, and all that you're left with is what was always in the hole. Simply a void. This episode shows us one thing and one thing alone. The cast and crew of this show know exactly where to hurt their target audience, and they are not afraid to do that. Or I think so, at least. I actually didn't catch this episode on original airing. I just saw a rerun a couple weeks later. You are a disgusting swine. This frosted fucker assaults Bobert and gets everything that was coming to him. 9 out of 10. So a bit of wordplay here, both in that the episode has the surface level element of an actual butterfly being on Miss Simeon's desk. The episode both opens with a scene of Charles screaming about seeing Banana Joe's butt, and we also see a character mentioning bug spray and flies are bugs. We also get Bob doing whatever this is. As he leaves the class. This is because he randomly short circuits earlier in the episode and he launches a part from him, so I assume that missing part is causing it. Now you're probably expecting me to go in depth and say what this says about Bob, but really all it says is nothing. This episode seems like they wrote the title and then like bent the episode around to try and fit the title. 8 out of 10. What I like about this episode is it starts as if it's going to be a Photo Bob episode, with just some photos of him being present on Alan's Elmore Plus account. But that's just to lure you into a bit of a false sense of security, as the rest of the episode is perhaps the most visceral one in the entire show. I think so, at least. I'm not sure if visceral is the right word. The episode very smartly draws your attention to the foreground here, where Gooby and Alan are having a very loud diversion, I mean discussion, about meatballs or something that you'd think is central to the episode, when in reality it's completely meaningless spectacle. Entirely designed to draw your eyes to the left-hand side of the screen. And whilst these characters are much larger in the frame than anyone else, they do not actually matter. The only reason they are here is to form the actual frame where the central action of this episode happens, through the gap between them. Centered by this artificial frame is, well, who else but Bobert?
Good morning.
Who at first glance isn't really doing anything at all. He just fidgets with his drink that he for some reason bought. However, this time he's not hunched over or avoiding eye contact or looking longingly at someone else having fun. No, this time he is staring at something unflinchingly that, because where the camera is placed, we as the audience cannot see, probably. This time he's staring at you. Look at how his eyeline follows yours. As a fictional character peering through the fourth wall to see you, a fully sentient being watching the events of his life unfold as entertainment. The closest thing he could probably compare you to would be a god. And as the only person who can see you, they'll make him the closest person to God here, and therefore a saint. This all being exactly the reason the scene was set up this way. Or, I don't know, maybe you're just meant to be focusing on the meatball bit and Bob happens to be following the same event. Cause you know, a guy jumping on a table, screaming and rubbing himself with a meatball is the sort of thing that tends to draw your eye. And you know, that's probably the only reason that your eye lines kind of match up. Either way, solid 10 out of 10. This episode's pretty cut and dry. We see some rooms full of monitors displaying the lives of various people going about their day-to-day lives, while some random people go about in these rooms in some story that doesn't matter. And of course, one of the people most clear on these monitors is the old Bobster. You may be asking why there's an episode that's entirely just some monitors with Bob on them. But you see, this episode simply exists to remind you that you are being watched. 9 out of 10.
I'm the Joker, baby!
What more is there to say? 9 out of 10. This is probably the most iconic episode in the entirety of the show. Well, apart from. Well, we'll get to that in due time. This episode is entirely known for one gag. You know it, I know it. In this episode, we see the world of Elmore degrading into increasing levels of unfinished animation as they are running out of money, as the title implies. This is a fun meta gag, and it's half the reason anyone talks about the show, so I can't really give this anything less than a 10 out of 10. And that's series 3, a really interesting series here. The episode lengths tend to lean towards the short side here, and if I'm remembering correctly, with the exception of the Joy, Bobert never speaks in this season, which is a really interesting limitation the writers put on themselves in this season. It really helps this season feel unique in the ways they explore Bobert in more unconventional ways. Granted, I'm glad they didn't stick with this in later seasons, but as a way to distinguish this season from the rest, it's great. Gossamer's a pretty self-absorbed character, and in this episode we see that in full effect. It starts with him declaring that his class is the only one in his school, which obviously leads to one of the other students leaving town in sadness. Of course, he and Charles can't fix this on their own, they need to call in the Bobster to stand a chance. Despite a small setback, they do manage to catch up with her and inform her that her dad got a new job, as that was the conflict, I guess. 8 out of 10. The cafeteria. This never bodes well for Bobert. But this episode starts pretty well for him. He's sitting on a populated table, more confident than usual it would seem, with what appears to be all the other smart kids in the school. Assumedly having an intellectual debate on which of this show's Happy Meal toys are the most terrifying. But it quickly changes for the worse as this mistake starts being a total Kevin, and then belittles Gantok and his siblings, and even though they've been pretty bad to Bobert, he's still entirely on their side, as he's a beacon of shining morality. Then he starts nodding in support when Garfield gets real DX fights back. And for this subhuman little Duba steals Bobert's arm and assaults Grey Matter with it. It hurts to see Bob get screwed over like this, but it's important to keep in mind the fact that in this universe, people don't treat him well. Also, this episode highlights the quality of his character really well, making sure the audience knows that he is just the best person, full stop. 8 out of 10. Man, Bobert has short-circuited a lot throughout this show, and every time it's done without a hint of remorse from anyone involved. This time, Bobert's taken out while trying to buy a gift for a classmate's birthday, and given how Bob is eternal, he obviously survives this. And this. And he still manages to get a gift. On its own, this one's not saying much, but in the context of the show as a whole, it really helps illuminate some changes in dynamics that will come later, so it is valuable. 8 out of 10. You all thought it wasn't possible, but it's right here. What you always wanted but never knew that you did. A multi-Bob story. This episode is a special event, an experience more than an episode. It consists of a simple plot of Bobert being pressured into upgrading himself with these two chuckle but then the upgrade significantly changes and breaks Bobert on both a technical and a personal level, and through this we get a cavalcade of character development, not just for Bobert, but also for the aforementioned chuckle Luigi and Charles. They start where you'd expect them to based off earlier episodes, pressuring Bobert into getting the titular upgrade as they don't care for him as a person but only the superficial gadgets and features he has that they can use. So they pull a reverse the mystery and destroy Bobert's self-esteem, so much so that he gets the upgrade despite their clearly feigned care of how it would affect him.
I want the upgrade.
As long as it is your decision.
None of the features work as intended, and thus the aforementioned chuckle take Bobert to be returned to normal at the Bobert store, but only because he's now annoying them. Comic hijinks ensue on the way to the Bobert store, and when we finally get there, we get some solid satire of the tech industry.
We've been sent back to our factory with the rest of our products that we purposefully designed to fail so that your force,
and more importantly, the aforementioned chuckle are confronted with the most extreme version of the way that they treat Bobert. When the store associates act as if the Boberts are interchangeable, and instead of fixing Bobert, they try to scrap our Bobert and dump a new Bobert on the aforementioned. You get who I mean. Now at first Goomboss begins to entertain the idea of keeping the new Bobert, but upon seeing how distinctly more, well, robotic this robot is, and having the new Bob fail to save his life whilst good old Bobert does it with ease, we see that at the end, he and his brother have taken what they have seen to heart. After restoring our Bobert, they choose him over the new Bobert, and finally embrace our Bobert for who he is. And whilst this is great development for the pair, as in earlier episodes we've seen them so nonchalantly harm Bobert or use him just to win an argument with the other, so this growth makes them significantly more likable remarkable, as the only reason you should care for someone is if they also like Bobert. But what matters even more than that is what this episode means for Bobert himself. Until this point in the show, Bobert's always been trying to be accepted by his peers so he can make some actual friends and be less lonely. But here, Bobert is finally seen as more than an appliance by some of the people in his school. And as they finally see him as a fully sentient person with real emotions, that allows him to begin to grow into believing that himself later in the show. With his two new friends who have finally proven themselves to be worthy additions to the cast, Gumball and Darwin continue to help him along this path throughout the rest of the show, as he grows more openly expressive and comfortable with people. So, this episode is funny, emotional, topical, and tests its entire cast on how they view Bobert, including Bobert. How could this be anything other than a 10 out of 10?
We're happy to grow obsolete together.
Little sidebar here. Anyone else notice how happy Alan was about being wed to Leslie? You are a committed man, Alan. Have some restraint. Jeez. So, releasing in 2015, this episode came out just as the world was getting into this super obsession with superhero movies that we're still in today. This episode plays with that in a pretty simple way, with everyone in the school singing a sort of generic superhero-y theme. Bobert's firmly buying into this, singing along with everyone we see in the hallway. Gumball, however, evidently isn't, as he desperately tries to run away from all the superhero fans. I guess he isn't a fan then. This episode is clearly a nice show of how the pair's relationship has developed, as they're now having one of those strong media disagreements that friends do probably. 8 out of 10. Alan was there throughout the entirety of the mystery, and yet he was spared from the absolute verbal devastation that Bob could have brought upon him. Alan is a lucky guy. Or he was a lucky guy, as this episode shows Gumball and Darwin getting recommended Alan's Ice Bucket Challenge. It was 2015, and when they eventually click on it, we see Bobert making up for letting the ego of
The gas-filled bag defined as Alan.
get by unscathed in Series 1.
Communication error. You are not friends with Gumball.
I think it's better to just give to the cause without doing the challenge, but...
Logic error. Why are you doing it then? Negative. Altruistic aid of others will provide zero insulation.
And then just to cap it off, he kills him. 10 out of 10. Bobert is great, and we all know this. Hell, I've went over it earlier in this video, and by Series 4, we've definitely established this as a fact. And just like this episode does, I'd say his weekly presence back when the show was airing would be best compared to that of a hug. In how warm and inviting it is. In how it makes you feel wanted, without you having to earn it, or do anything, as for one moment you can just be, and know that at least one person values you. You just need to let it wash over you like ghostly grape-scented Scooby-Doo bubble bath, and it makes your day infinitely better. Just like ghostly grape-scented Scooby-Doo bubble bath. That is the point that this episode is making. That is the connection it is drawing to the Bobster. And the episode chooses to show this by having Bobert walk past Gumball, and Gumball not engaging with Bobert leaves him cold and angry, as he just stands there, not doing anything, just being, angrily, like he's just been washed over with Campbell's Scooby-Doo condensed soup. 8 out of 10. This episode is just the scene of Bobert running away from a flaming bus called The Girlfriend. There is no reading I can provide for this one without sounding very, boomer. So, because of this, I'm going to give this episode a non-canon out of 10. Now, you might be saying, you can't just declare an episode as non-canon because you don't like the messaging behind it. And, well, to that, I say, yes I can, you piece of shit. I appreciate this episode for giving CN's audience the most important piece of advice I ever learned. If anything goes wrong, if you can't find your keys, if your anxiety is worse than it normally is, if you're split in half and need to be carried over a puddle, scratched at a ravine of oil, there is only one thing you must always do. You must trust in the Bobert. He's trying his best. This is invaluable advice. We all needed to hear it. 10 out of 10. So, a musical episode here. We've had the occasional song scattered throughout the show, but this is the first episode entirely centered on one. And as the first musical episode, it very smartly eases you into the idea by using a topic very common in the genre, romance. With Bob falling in love being at the center of this narrative, well, kind of at the center, I'll get into this later. The song itself is great, it's funny, charming, shows off Bob's character really well, and as well as this, it has most of the characters in the show making some sort of appearance here. Plus we get the usual great attention to detail and little hidden gags that really characterize this show as going one step beyond what they needed to do. Like how the file Bob mistakes as a malfunction is called iloveyou.exe, the same name as the file from the Lovebug email virus from the early 2000s. But for me, what really endears me to this episode is seeing a lot more of Bobert's genuine friendship with the Wattersons as they lead the musical number and try to help Bobert through this. But these things are just the cherries on top of an already delicious sundae. Because what's really at the core of this episode is what's quite possibly the most important piece of growth Bobert goes through throughout the entirety of this show. All the way from the robot, we have seen that even though Bobert consistently has and expresses emotions, he's unable to accept that he does have them. As if he can just make himself believe that he just cannot have emotions, that it's against his programming. It becomes so much easier for him to stop trying and just grow numb to the loneliness he feels. To just accept his lack of emotional connections, because feeling nothing all the time is just that little bit better than trying to make a connection with someone and deluding himself into believing that he did, only to have it snatched away from him at the last moment because he did it wrong. This is why he assumes when he unmistakably feels love, it has to be a malfunction. And this is why it's so powerful when at the episode's end he finally admits for the first time in the show that he has had an emotion, showing the most important step in him growing to be the person he will be at the end of the series, who fully displays as much emotion as his living classmates, even if it takes him a little bit to get there. He's going at his own pace, don't rush him. And because of this becomes such a pivotal episode to the show as a whole. And even more importantly, it gives us what we've all been craving since episode 1, a Bobarino musical number.
Anyone can love, no love is wrong. I have now become a lovesick dreamer. I fell in love with this old vacuum cleaner.
Do I even need to say it? 10 out of 10. Most living things in nature need to sleep, but our favourite Bobster is a robot, so does he? This important question is raised and answered by this episode, where we see that he does sleep, or power down I guess, in this little charging port. Finally, a question we've asked for like 4 seconds, answered. Also, him having the screensaver when he sleeps is a cute joke too. 9 out of 10. Another musical episode here, and unlike The Love, this one doesn't have any setup, it just throws you right into the song. The song in this episode is less tied to the character of Bobert in particular, but instead is about embracing people's differences, which works great with the large ensemble singing the song being made up of a variety of characters from throughout the show, almost all of which being done in completely different animation styles, adding another layer to the song. This one's really adorable and charming, and seeing this compilation of characters all together is really great. 9 out of 10. Our second and final Halloween special here, and this one's got a pretty simple setup. Dumble tells a ghost story to his classmates trying to scare them, but then it turns out that the ghost in said story is real and winds up scaring off the entire class. The titular scam is how this piece of Ghost swindles Bob out of a perfectly good calculator. It's a decent episode altogether. It's a fun setup with some great visual comedy and some really nice references with the class's costumes. It is a really weird finale to this season though, as is kind of a habit with the show as a whole. It doesn't tie in thematically with the rest of the season, nor does it feel like it has particularly high stakes compared to the average episode. But if you can look past this though and just judge it as an episode on its own merits, it's great. 8 out of 10. With Series 4 complete, we are now firmly in the second half of the show. And at this point, the show has settled on a style. There aren't really any major changes from here on out. Well, in terms of designs and format at least, this season clearly shows the characters are still developing. This season in particular, having probably the most concentrated amount of development for Bobert, in particular with his relationship to Gumball and Darwin. I do feel this season in particular is really weirdly ordered though. The scam is completely unrelated to the season's central arcs and themes, and those really take center stage in this season. Though that may just come down to discrepancies in airing and production order though. It's probably that. I mean, it's on their side, definitely. I mean, I'm not cutting out any of the episodes in this season. Why would you think that? What? An emotional roller coaster, this one. We open with Bobert dying, but then he gets better and fights a T-Rex, as we were promised in Series 2. And may I say, it is very nice seeing Bobert's combat mode transformation in the much more fluid animation of the show's latter half. I mean, look at it, it's beautiful. One thing holding it back, which I'll admit, it's a nitpick, is this. Bobert's mouth is clearly here. The light up bits are his mouth, but this episode treats it as if this is Bob kissing Carmen, when in reality, it's way closer to a headbutt, which seems weird as a mistake for these characters to make. It doesn't seem like they would. I mean, they haven't in the show up to this point, like never. And I mean, I've reviewed the entire show, so I would know. Nothing's been left out. Anyways, no, 9 out of 10. Bob fighting a T-Rex is pretty cool. Next episode, woo! Now, we're all familiar with the hit film Spy Kids 3 Game Over, and of course, the film's most iconic character, the guy. That character, in the context of the film he's from, is supposed to be the chosen one, the most important character in that story, and yet he winds up being just a disappointment and dying. What a bitch. This episode chooses to directly parallel this film, and more importantly, the fall of the guy in particular. Obviously. I mean, it would have to. Otherwise, what would be the point in this tangent? Well, why would I just go off about Spy Kids 3 for no reason in this Bob-centric video? It would have no relevance. I mean, it does though. This episode makes sure you're under the understanding that Bobert is the most important character in this show. A fact they have to affirm in the 5th season because they directly parallel the film in question by having Bobert do the one thing Elijah Wood couldn't stop himself from doing. Bobert doesn't die. 9 out of 10. In this very special episode of Bobert's show, we see how to deal with the discovery that a politician you have supported not having the people who they are elected to serve's best interest at heart, and how you deal with that. Obviously what 6 to 12-year-olds need to learn. We open on Bobert learning about Alan's run for school president, and he thinks he's quite a good candidate, so he decides to pass this opinion on to Banana Joe. Banana Joe says,
surely, once you're done shaking it, it should be called a milk shook.
Which inevitably leads to a and once they got that out of their system, they move on with the plot. We see Alan giving a speech, and more importantly, we see that he's enlisted Bob to help him gesticulate in the speech, because, you know, he doesn't have arms. But partway through the speech, we see Bob begin to realise Alan's manipulation, and how what he's doing isn't coming from any sort of genuine place. And thus, Bobert determines to publicly dissociate from Alan. And as he requested, Bobert then strikes him down as a symbol of him not living up to his promises. And then the episode ends with Bobert walking towards the camera as Alan walks away, representing Bobert moving forwards in his life, aiming to improve and grow to make up for his mistake in the support of Alan, whilst Alan moves away from the camera, symbolizing his continual descent and regression. Some really powerful stuff presented here. Really powerful, intentional stuff. 9 out of 10. Yeah, I guess Bobert isn't the safest person to be around, really, is he? Granted, in most of these situations he had some sort of justification, but still, someone with so much destructive potential having a bit of a habit of taking things a little bit too literally, well, that was always going to end in a little bit of disaster. But usually, when he takes things literally, it's in a harmless way. Well, except in the bet, but he was in slave mode there, so that doesn't really count. He wasn't actually in control. But in this episode, we see Gumball and Darwin take note of this trait of his, and in trying to fix it, they wind up making it significantly worse. In this episode, they keep asking him to integrate commands, trying to make him less dangerous, but whenever Bobert tries to follow these commands to the letter, it just winds up making him more violent compared to when he just made decisions for himself. Like, way more violent. Like, literally a second away from driving all of humanity to extinction. Violent. Like with the slave mode before it though, it's not like these commands completely eradicate any hint of a personality Bobert had. He's willing to pause the eradication of all humanity, well, once again, not really humanity, but all humanity in order to hear Gumball and Darwin out. Because as his friends, he respects them enough to believe they could provide a new perspective on the situation. As it's not like he wants to kill everyone, it's just the new commands integrated into him have made him believe he has to. And he'd be willing to stop if anyone found any flaws in the logical chain of progression that led him into thinking he needs to kill all of humanity. Darwin doing so winds up saving everyone. And even more importantly, this is showing how he's still entirely willing to destroy people's self-esteem. And of course, the episode ends with Bobert going right back to normal. The bones of this story are very similar to that of the bet, but I think it changes enough to be its own episode. Plus, it shows our second ever look inside of Bobert's house, so, you know, that's nice. 9 out of 10. Another aging episode here, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe our last Photo Bob episode. Rest in peace, we will not miss you. We see a future yearbook with Bobert on the right hand side here. It's a simpler metaphor being applied here compared to most of the show, as it just compares the fragility of age to that of a vase. It's not a particularly complex or layered comparison, but it does its job I guess, so 8 out of 10. Well, the episode Degrades entirely consists of Bobert sitting in class reading a book. This is because to get good grades you need to be smart, and books make you smart. Okay, genuine question right now. If you are still watching the video this far into it, I just need to ask you, why? Like, what entertainment value is this providing for you? Because to give myself a little bit of credit, I do think I was able to get some mileage out of the joke of, he's doing an in-depth analysis of something that nobody else cares about. But to be entirely honest, I do not think it was over an hour's worth of mileage, and there are very few jokes outside of that. And at this point, I really wish I was able to just give up on making this video, but I am so dedicated to this metallic bastard that I guess I'll just continue. So I guess 8 out of 10. On to the next one. Loved it. It's here. What everyone has been waiting for. The episode with the most iconic scene in the entirety of the show. Now, if we could just move past this moment for a little bit. We can see a very important step in the evolution of Bob as a character, as the episode opens with Bobert in a cafeteria, which usually is a terrible sign. But what makes this episode different is since the last time he's been here, he's went through some substantial changes. He has gained genuine friends who are willing to go significant lengths to help him out, and he has finally admitted that he does in fact have emotions. Both of these being his main sources of insecurity beforehand. And now that he can accept that he has both, if he can just be that little bit more confident in himself, which is shown in this episode because for the first time here, he's doing fine. He's sitting comfortably with other people on the table and seemingly interacting with one of them. And unlike in other episodes, this doesn't get ruined. It doesn't turn out that the person he was sitting with was a jerk here, or that they could be involved in some huge pen-chewing scandal. I mean, the Boborino does get scuffed up a little, but that in no way relates to the people he's sitting with. It's just a case of wrong place, wrong time. Of course, it's not like all of a sudden Bobert is a social butterfly. That would feel weird and out of place and way too quick. And sure, his body language is far more open now, but he still keeps his head down and doesn't look directly at the person he's talking to. And sure, he doesn't seem to mind or be actively avoiding interaction with Alan here, but he also really isn't interacting with him at all. At this point you may be saying, yeah, sure, but then what actually has improved? Because the way I've described it makes it sound like he's just doing the same thing he always does. But he has grown, just at a realistic rate, shown through the interactions with the person he's talking to. You know, because he actually interacts with her, unlike with Alan. Here we see Kerry seems to be making conversation with Bob, and if you look closely, you see Bob's mouth lights up, meaning he's replying, showing him not only regaining the progress he lost in the banana, but taking it one step further, and now actually interacting with the other person on his table. What they're actually talking about though is anyone's guess, because the show's usual framing puts Gumball and Carmen in the foreground, and we hear their conversation instead of the way more interesting one happening back there. But it seems to me that they're probably bonding over the fact that neither of them are technically living, and for separate reasons neither of them can actually eat the food that they're served. Given how he seems to have been awkwardly showing his spoon to her just before the scene started, then seems to do it again once Gumball sits down. Of course avoiding making eye contact with her, but never turning his head the entire time. And it's nice seeing him bond with a character he's only ever really interacted with once, and even still that one interaction wasn't that significant. Perfectly showing how he's gradually growing. I just realised that rhymed. Perfectly showing how he's making some serious headway in this aspect. And then obviously this half of the episode ends with... And yeah, I did say half. The gift that keeps on giving this episode, eh? As to further encapsulate how much he's grown in certain aspects, and to establish half the reason why he was even able to have the interaction in the first half of the episode, we see an evolution of the normal hijinks Gumball and Darwin get into. As Darwin just straight up shoots Bobber. You know, normal stuff. And whilst we never learn what led him to do this, unlike in pre-The Upgrade episodes, we see Darwin clearly doesn't want to do this and sheds a tear afterwards, showing a clear change in how the Wattersons treat Bobber, making it apparent how much their relationship has grown. Yeah, this episode has a reason for being so iconic. It's a masterpiece. Obviously a 10 out of 10, I would give it higher if I could. There's definitely a reason this one's called the best. So, continuing the theme of confusing finales, like, seriously, with the exception of Series 1, every series ends on what feels like just any average episode. None of which, may I add, ever give Bob a line, including Series 1's one. It's almost like the vast majority of these episodes were never even designed to be finales. That's weird, right? Anyways, this episode's just an everyday scenario turned to an extreme. You know, a pretty common setup in animated shows. In this case, it's people being competitive about getting a good space in line to see a new movie. You know, Bob murks some people, Bob gets murks, then the murkers talk about their tickets for a bit. It's kinda funny, but not especially. 8 out of 10. That's Series 5, shorter series than usual, just sort of continues along the same trajectory that Series 4 did. And I'll be honest, before the rewatch I did for this video, I had a hard time separating the two in my mind. I guess apart from the dropping of the musical episodes from Series 4, which is a shame. I mean, it's a good season and all, but I just don't really have anything to say about it collectively, so I guess I should just move on to the final season then. This title chooses to single out a single character from the rest of the cast as the one, separating them from the common folk that populate the show. This is obviously referring to Bobert, who's singled out from the rest of the cast due to him being better than every other character. The episode shows this as he gives the best card to an injured Gumball and then survives an assassination attempt. Bobert is better than everyone else in the show, therefore this episode speaks the truest of truths, and I must give it a 10 out of 10. So, here we have it, the least political episode in the entire show. There's actually not a single political undertone here. I believe it's been described as the anti-allegory. Every single thing in this episode is meant to be taken entirely at face value with no deeper meaning whatsoever. Its plot starts when most of the notable student characters are locked in a room together. Bobert informs them that the room will soon be lit.
I mean, literally on fire, it is a scientific fact.
And that's obviously not good, so the students need to stop that urgently. But the rampant denial of this problem by certain students winds up making the situation for everyone much worse and harder to prevent. No allegory here though. And all this fighting over what they should do about this problem, if anything at all, winds up leading the students to decide to hold an election, a competition to determine which of them should be the leader. This winds up going horribly, with the students being more divided than they were before. But even still, when the school gets fully, the students are still able to put aside their differences and use all their individual talents to work together and stop the problem before it kills them all. See, I told you it couldn't work as a political allegory. Anyways, this episode really manages to showcase how the animation has improved so perfectly. The episode has the characters becoming increasingly more worn and dirty as it progresses, showing the increasing severity of the situation they're in, with the colours used and the amount of sweat on each character clearly showing how much hotter each scene is. Also, need I remind you that the episode gave us this? So this episode definitely felt like one that needed to be made, not just because of the power of, but it also shows a little bit of growth between Gumball and Bobert's relationship. In, of course, the iconic line, as this shows Bobert trying to use slang, which he's not exactly ever been good with. He's probably heard his classmates using this word a lot and just assumes, given the word's dictionary definition, that his classmates are all referring to something being set alight. And even though Bob has misinterpreted this, Gumball doesn't correct him on the definition like he would have before. He just lets Bob correct him on the definition as if he got it wrong, as he accepts that Bob is beginning to improve on this and just decides to silently help build his confidence. A great moment that reinforces how much Gumball does truly care for Bobert now, even in this episode where he plays the antagonist. How I know it was Gumball he was talking to when, according to me, the show only ever shows us shots with Bobert in frame and we don't see Gumball in any of the shots with Bob saying this. 9 out of 10. I feel like this episode's only held back because the narrative really needed a little bit more depth to it to tie everything together. Given the premise, it could have worked great as an allegory for the 2016 American presidential. The titular pact here, like in the apology, refers to nothing within the show itself, but instead, a simple pact between the writers and the audience that Bob is eternal and therefore shall live through any form of harm he will ever face. He will always survive, he will always endure, and even total disintegration cannot stop him. So yeah, it's nice to have his immortality confirmed, and you know, I'd say it's nice enough to give this episode a 10 out of 10. So it was probably one of the best titles in the show. The shippening deals with the tropes of shipping, as you would expect. But of course with the greatest character created in any form of media ever at the centre. It's a great parody which does it all. It pairs up characters with no notable interactions up to this point. It puts together characters who only share scenes when they need to assault each other. And most importantly, it contains the element you were all expecting, war. And given how
right now, Vor is more powerful than most nations,
I feel I'm having my arm twisted into giving this an 8 out of 10. The upgrade taught us that Boberts are mass-produced. This episode educates us in how the factories that make Bobs operate, and allows us to see how they look. There's some social commentary on the modern workplace delivered in a pretty good gag, and that's about all I can say. This episode doesn't do anything more, but it was never trying to do anything else. It's just a simple good gag. 8 out of 10. Oh boy, our last Cafeteria Bob episode. I did not think this would get me so emotional. Well, anyways, this episode serves to be a direct counterpoint to the best. as the titles would suggest, as in that episode we see the culmination of a lot of the growth he has went through in the show at that point, and how it has made these smaller but meaningful improvements to his life. You know, when we see the best experience he's been able to have with other people at his school. Whilst this episode makes the audience come to the understanding that not every day will be like that for him. And yes, Bobert has found some genuine friends in Gumball and Darwin, but there are tiers to friends, and like, whilst yes, to Bobert, Gumball and Darwin will be pretty much top tier for him, as he doesn't know too many people that well. But Gumball and Darwin are significantly more social than Bob, and at an estimate, I would place him at like upper middle tier on their tier lists. And given how these two are the only people he's ever explicitly been shown to be emotionally vulnerable with, it means this disparity in how important they are to each other would leave Bob with significant lulls. Long dead spaces where he doesn't have any sort of notable interpersonal interactions with people. Sure, his posture is much better than it used to be, and he's not actively avoiding eye contact like he did before, but he still, just like in the Skull, is asking questions about himself. So whilst yeah, he has real friends now, he still wishes he could be closer to them or anyone just so he wouldn't be alone so much. As I said in the best, Bob grows realistically, and that's really what's at the heart of this show. He doesn't just get a couple of friends and all of a sudden they're together all the time and they just fix all his problems for him. He's still got to work on all this stuff internally, one step at a time, and lucky for him, he's already taken quite a few steps. Once again, a great counterpiece to the best. He's growing, but at his own rate. 9 out of 10. Stink. Informal. Be very unpleasant, contemptible, or scandalous. Yeah, scandalous is how I'd describe this one. Gumball and Darwin have apparently gotten someone killed, and they haven't even called Bobert, who could have gotten rid of someone way quicker. 8 out of 10. Gumball Watterson is racist. Need I say any more? Yes. Huh, weird, wouldn't think so. Well, I don't think I need to explain any further. Bob gets the last word, 9 out of 10. So this episode plays with the classic buddy cop formula, but from the perspective of one of the suspects. The suspect in question here being Bobert. They go with the classic good cop, bad cop formula. Bob dodges some questions, tells a few porkies, as telling the truth would reveal some personal information the suspect doesn't want to get out. But you know, eventually, said suspect is coerced into telling the truth, and almost cracks the case for the investigators, but then is taken out. It doesn't do anything particularly original with the format, and said format isn't one I've ever really cared about, but like I said back in the Joy, it has Bob, therefore the format is now great. Also, not really about the episode in particular, but this episode is really the one that made me notice it. Bob is so much more expressive in this season due to all the growth he has gone through. And every time it happens, it is always heartwarming to see him cut himself a break after all these seasons of him proverbially kicking himself for not having real emotions. It was going to be an 8 out of 10, but that spiel has convinced me into giving it a 9. So Gumball got off pretty lightly in the mystery.
Then Gumball turned up, looking love-struck as usual.
This episode fixes that.
But hey, now I really do look like a
Friendless dork on prom night.
And whilst that would be enough to give this episode a 10 out of 10 on its own, it's not the reason this episode won a British Animation Award. It's an incredibly smart and well-written episode that takes the format of a James Bond film, and as the show is known to at this point, makes said format infinitely better with the presence of this legend. It's one of the funniest and most dynamic episodes of the show. It's constantly moving, with a lot of really great action that really puts the animation of this show to the test. And that test being one that the show definitely passes. And of course I can't forget the single line that I am certain is the entire reason it won an award for its writing.
Robot Child, I'm very disappointed in you.
Brilliant. As you can probably tell, this is a 10 out of 10. In the 2021 film, The Suicide Squad, we're introduced to the character of Abner Krill, or the Polka Dot Man. He has the ability to throw deadly polka dots at people, an ability he gained through his mother putting him through horrific experiments in order to turn him into a superhero. This expectation weighing on him throughout his entire life, not helped by the fact that everyone around him thinks him and by extension his powers are the lamest things possible. Literally the first thing that happens to him in the entire movie is he gets mocked by Calendar Man. That's how low on the totem pole he is. And after years of putting up with this, he's entirely bought into it himself. Like, it's to the point that when he uses his powers to save his team's life, he feels the need to apologize for doing so, just because of how lame he thinks it looks. And despite most of the people around him being guilty of significantly worse crimes than him, he's the one who finds it hardest to believe he's any sort of hero. Because he's not suave, he's not desensitized to death. And I'm pretty sure the guy from Paddington called him a beta male. Which, have you seen him dancing? This is pure, bona fide Plimbo male energy. But at the end of the movie, he sees all the damage his powers are able to do to this giant space kaiju, and is finally able to see his value and admit that he is a superhero. Now, of course, you're a smart person. You can pick up on trends. You're obviously saying, okay, cool, how does this tie into Bob's characterization in this episode? Well, you see, that's the interesting part. It doesn't! You think you can predict how I format my videos? The entire tirade meant nothing! So, I guess onto the actual review now. Decisions. We all need to make a variety of important decisions in our day-to-day lives. But the most important one of all is whether or not you want to hear Bob singing Happy Birthday in our final ever musical episode. And there is a right answer. 9 out of 10. Okay, big moment here, the last episode, and this one needs just the littlest bit of explaining. The Amazing World of Gumball was initially pitched as a show about a remedial school for failed cartoon characters, with an image to go along with this pitch of a collection of diverse characters in a variety of different art styles together in a schoolyard. That image, the collection of characters all completely different from one another, but somehow tying together into something that against all odds felt cohesive, that is what caught the eyes of the CN higher-ups, and that is what led to the show eventually getting the green light. And that's why the collage of distinct art styles feels so central to the show's DNA, making it what probably is the main thing people think of when the show is brought up. Well, apart from... And this is reflected a lot in the text of the show itself. Episodes like The Upgrade, or especially the compilation, put a lot of emphasis on the idea of embracing the things that make you different, as they're what make you, you. All these things being the reasons the premise for the finale is perfect. It introduces a live-action antagonist who, above all else, wants to homogenize the show's cast. He makes his intentions clear.
This school is diseased, and I'm the medicine.
Then he gets to work, pretty quickly it would seem, as he turns Bob into a human off-screen, but you know, that doesn't last too long, and he's quickly restored to his regular swag form. Then of course the rest of the show's cast celebrate their victory of having saved the only character who matters in the whole school, before they go to confront the antagonist. He tries to escape, they get him, they unmask him, and then we get the twist, that all along he was actually this guy. Rob, I believe. You know him. He briefly appeared in The Love. It's a pretty weird choice for a twist villain, given how he's literally never appeared in a significant role before. I wouldn't lie to you. This show is only made up of 76 episodes, each one centering on his metallic bass. So then Rob tries to explain why he did what he did, but promptly dies beforehand, ending the series. And whilst yes, the setup for this episode is great for the reasons I've explained earlier, I do feel like the cliffhanger it ends on is kinda odd. We don't know Rob, and the line,
Don't you understand what's going on in Elmore?
Implies there's some sort of higher purpose he's serving through the actions in this episode, but he gets murked before he can say what said purpose is. I understand why this happened. The show's team wanted a movie to cap off this show, which luckily enough we have been confirmed to be getting that. The CN Twitter announced it earlier this year, but this episode aired in 2019. Those were 3 years where avid Bobheads didn't know whether or not his story would be wrapped up or that this plot point would ever be resolved. But now we know we'll be getting both. Probably. We don't actually have a synopsis for the film, so anything could theoretically happen in it. For all we know, it's just a shot-for-shot remake of Furry Vengeance. But even if the movie doesn't provide a satisfying conclusion to where this episode left off, this episode does have appropriately high stakes, and it does feel tied enough to the show's identity to be the first finale that actually feels like one since the fight. I think the main drawback to this episode is Bobert takes quite a bit of a backseat in this one. There's no real conclusion or epilogue to any of the arcs he's went through so far. He doesn't actually interact with any of the characters we're actually invested in his relationship with, and he only has one line, which is all because this episode wants to focus on the student body as a whole, rather than Bobert in particular, which is a bit disappointing. I wish he would have had at least a little bit of an interaction with Gumball and Darwin, given how much their relationship has been built up throughout the show. But still, in spite of this episode does work for what it is going for, and does serve as a solid enough finale to the show as a whole, and therefore, I'm gonna give the final episode of The Amazing World of Gumball a 9 out of 10, I guess, but it was closer to an 8 than it was a 10. Alright, that is all 76 episodes of The Amazing World of Gumball reviewed. Like, I know that's the word I use, but even still, it doesn't really feel like an adequate descriptor of whatever the hell this was. But either way, this is way too much of my time, and more importantly, yours spent on the dissection of this series. I mean, to be fair, it is the only show with the single greatest creation of all mankind. But seriously, have you seen how long that runtime is? I mean, if you haven't, you've definitely at least felt it. Still, I haven't done the overview of Series 6 though, so better get started with that. Series 6. Woo! I feel this series was a good conclusion to the show as a whole. Granted, we don't really see Bobert develop as a character in this series, which is a bit disappointing, as there were definitely some interesting places you could have taken him, given where Series 5 left him off. However, this season instead is focused on seeing the payoff of all the character development he underwent in earlier seasons, which is a fair route to take given how Series 4 and 5 brought a lot of closure to the main character beats set up in the first season. He now has meaningful interpersonal relationships, is less awkward around people, and most importantly, he is now consistently shown to have accepted that he does have emotions, and he expresses them much more regularly throughout this season. He's still himself though. He's not all of a sudden become a different character. He's still Bobert. Of course he's still like 95% sass. Of course he still doesn't quite get how to interact with other people. And of course he still wants nothing more than for said people to include him. The difference is this season he's now gotten to the point where he's getting that, at least a little bit. And he has grown so much in the show. Not only does it feel natural every time we see this happen, but it also just feels so deserved and just makes you feel so happy for him. And this natural conclusion to Bob's arc really helps tie together and elevate every other season, making this, in my opinion, as perfect of a final season as is possible with this show. Which actually partially surprised me, as whilst I had seen every episode around about airing when the show was coming out, I've never actually binged the whole show in order and saw how well it came together firsthand. And that kind of makes the space I'm in now a really weird space. I've always wanted to watch the show like this, and now that I've finally done it to commemorate Bobert's first decade in our hearts, I've kind of finished Bobert, if that makes sense. I've watched every episode, read every comic, bought every figure, seen every ad or clip show special, played every mediocre Flash game. Sure, eventually the film will drop and I'll get like 47 seconds of new Bob content, but then after that I'll be finished. And it's not like there's much of a legacy or discussion for Bob. Sure, there is for the show, but for some reason, people seem really attached to the characters like Gumball or Darwin or Nicole, which, may I say, people seem to be a bit too attached to Nicole. Anyways, there's all this love for all these supporting and even minor characters, but the show's main character himself? Next to nothing. Don't get me wrong, there is some Bob posting out there if you look for it, but for the main character of the last great American cartoon, there's shockingly little. I mean, I get why these smaller characters get so popular. It can be really hard to relate to the main characters of a show. Not everyone has relationships that define them like the central cast need to be interesting. They don't really have mortal enemies or any real conflict specific to them in particular. They don't do interesting things, and interesting things don't happen to them. Maybe they have something that's so integral to them as a person that's never properly represented in media. In all of these situations and more, it can be really hard to find a protagonist relatable. So it's so much easier to just find a minor character who displays parts of this thing that is so integral to them, often by accident on the creative team's part, and then just project the rest of themselves onto this character in order to feel less alone in these fields. They can just say that these characters feel what in reality they do, and all of a sudden this aspect of them isn't a problem. It's just what Gumball is going through. And I'm not looking down on this at all. It's great that these characters that the writers likely never thought of as anything more than just an empty vessel full of easy gag potential can mean so much to certain people. Though, you know, my favourite one is the main character, and the one I assure you every single animator, writer, voice actor, etc. was thinking of the entire time they developed the show. I believe I've passed the 10-minute mark now, so I think I can just about milk this video. I guess my closing thoughts are, as great as the show as a whole is, the entire thing pales in comparison to the greatness that is Bobert on his own. He's so well realised and developed, and more than that, he's meant so much to me for a decade, that despite just being a throwaway side character in a show with dozens, and despite how weird it feels to probably be the only person who thinks about how his debut episode could now get his ears pierced, I'm glad I got so attached to this second-rate cartoon character. As with confidence, I can say he'd be a lot less fond of himself if I never did. Wait, did I just say he's a side character? Fuck!
Anyone can love, no love is wrong. I have now become a lovesick dreamer. I fell in love with this old vacuum cleaner.
Your turn has terminated. Commencing my turn.